This is Vigneto, a podcast.
From the sun and soil they grow, from the land and sea they roam, drinking wine in the great unknown.
So on the Vigneto podcast, I'm doing a new series about books on the wine industry and different wine regions and areas and aspects of the wine industry. And my first guest in this new series is Alan Tardi. I've known Alan for a while. He is an educator, a wine writer, author, and in a past life, he was also a chef and a restaurateur. And I'm really excited to have him on the program. So, welcome. Hi, Alan. It's nice to have you on the Vigneto podcast. Thank you
Hi,
for joining
Susanna.
me.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here and chatting with you.
So, I know you're a published author of a couple of books, but your most recent book is the one on champagne. That's quite an achievement. Can we talk about it? Can you tell me about this book?
Sure. And and by talking about this book, I might have to kind of bring up the one that preceded it by about 10 years. But yes, the book is called Champagne Uncorked. And when I decided to really delve into champagne, I was actually living full time in Italy, in Piedmont. And you know, in Piedmont, I lived in a village right in the middle of the Barolo wine area. And I was working extensively in the vineyards and in the wineries, and I managed the Cantina Comunale in the village of Castiglione Folletto, where I lived. And in Piemonte, especially in the Barolo zone, the Piemontese are very straightforward in some ways. So you have usually one grape variety from one particular place, and that's with Barolo. That's how it is. Barolo Barbaresco. That's 100% of Nebbiolo, of course. From nowadays, from one particular site, or maybe a blend of different sites. That's how it was originally. But nowadays, there's a lot of emphasis on individual vineyard sites, whether they're bottled individually or some sites are blended together. And I was working in many of these different vineyard sites, and really there was this like oneness of Nebbiolo from one particular site that makes a wine. And when I had an opportunity to go to Champagne, and I think it was because I had written an article or two about sparkling wines for the New York Times, and I got this invitation to go to Champagne, and here I found something completely different, where that most Champagne, like most Barolo up until a certain point in history, most Champagne is a blend. Historically, it's a blend of not just different vineyard sites, but different grape varieties from many different places and even many different vintages. And so I was really blown away by this concept of mixing together all of these different ingredients, like making a very complicated recipe that kind of, when it works well, blends into this unique multidimensional whole that is much more than the sum of the individual parts. So I became really fascinated with that, and that's where the idea for this book about champagne came up. I really wanted to delve deeply into the méthode champenoise, the making of a classic cuvée.
So was it kind of not in juxtaposition or in opposition to, but sort of an addition to your view of terroir that you found living in Piedmont and working in Piedmont for so long? Was it a new definition of terroir to you?
Absolutely, it was, and that's a good way to put it. It's not like antithetical to that or oppositional. It's a different sort of approach to terroir because I was learning hands-on that each individual vineyard parcel, and in Piemonte they used to call them cru. It sounds French, and of course Piemonte. was once part of under French rule, and the dialect, the Piedmontese dialect, has a lot of French in it. So the Piedmontese did, and they still do, refer to individual vineyard sites as cru, and they have their own personality and their own identity, and part of it comes from exactly where they're located, what the soil makeup is, the exposition, all of those different components that altogether add up to terroir. And then that's translated into the wine. So in Champagne, in the classic cuvée, you have a blend of all these different grape varieties from different parcels and sites in the extensive area of Champagne. And what I really learned from that is that when it's done well, with thought and some kind of a logic behind, or a sensibility, let's put it that way, because it's not that logical necessarily, but when you blend all of these components in a way that kind of heightens the individual components of that, terroir still is there. It doesn't eliminate the terroir. It's sort of combining these different aspects into a whole. So that the terroir aspect is still there. It might not be quite as clear and exposed as, like I say, a single vineyard, a single parcel wine. But if you become familiar with the base wines, you see what they contribute to the whole, and that was one of the fascinating things that I had an opportunity to do. So the whole idea of this book about Champagne was to take one house, one maison, and follow through the entire complicated, prolonged process of creating a classic Champagne cuvée. And an important part of that, of course, it really starts with pre-harvest, how the season is developing from the wintertime to when the vine wakes up again after dormancy and bud break, and all of those things that lead up to harvest. And that's where I began in the book. Through to the vinification process, and then all of these individual base wines that are created. And one of the really fascinating parts of this whole sort of journey was doing an extensive tasting of the base wines. And that's how you really get to know them, from the same vintage, right? The new wines that have just been finished a fermentation process. And these are going to be the base wines for that particular cuvée, which is not a vintage Champagne, but usually there's the majority of the wine that goes into a classic Champagne cuvée is the majority of it is from a base year, and then you go back and add reserve wines as well. So it was really one of the really fascinating processes of researching and then writing this book about Champagne, was doing these tastings of the base wines from a given vintage, which in this case for the book was 2013. And that was really, really fascinating, because, and I talk a lot about this in the book, because it's crucial. It was critical to to my experience, but also understanding how a wine like this is created. When I was first tasting these wines, and I was sitting in with the tasting panel, the people, the chef de cave, and the other key people who were involved in the winery activity. And I've tasted many wines, and I've tasted, certainly being in Barolo, you taste many wines during the vinification process, which for Barolo takes at least 3 years, or sometimes much longer than that. You can taste the wines at different points in this development and maturation. And then once they're finally released, I did a lot of tastings in Barolo where you taste the recent releases of these wines, Barolo and Barbaresco. And when they're actually released after 3.5 years of aging, they're released, they're on the market, but they're very young, and it's hard initially to taste them. But I got used to that, and I got used to the tannin and things like that. But I had never done a tasting like this before of base wines in Champagne, because even when you taste a new, like a Champagne, a Barolo, or it could be a Brunello di Montepulciano, or a Torazzi, or something like that, a wine that needs time to mature and evolve once it's been released.
So
when you first taste it, everything is there in the glass, and then it's a question of how it's going to develop and settle down, and how long, when it's going to might reach its peak. What is the maturation frame? But when you're tasting these base wines in Champagne, it's not like that, because what you're tasting is just a component. It's like an individual ingredient from, a stew with many different ingredients added to it.
So you kind of have to imagine what other components that component will need and kind of keep all of these ideas in your head as time goes on, I would
Well,
imagine.
yes, and I was, and I still am, a novice at this. But people who have been doing this for all of their professional lives, and maybe even before that, they have they understand much better how it's going to happen. And the thing is, it's not just about the blending, because you have to remember that you're talking about different grape varieties from different places within the Champagne area, and they can be very, very different and distinct places. And remember, there are 7 different grape varieties that are permitted for Champagne, so it gets very complicated in that sense. Then you add the reserve wines to this, and some people add more than others. And but so you have then you have to create this very complex wine that is still not even the wine yet, because it has to undergo a second fermentation process, which changes everything. So and that's also, of course, a big part of the book. I followed this particular producer through this entire process, and this was based on the 2013 vintage. I don't even think the wine has been released yet. So there is the second fermentation process, and then there is the maturation process on the lees in the bottle afterwards. So these are things that really have a incredible impact on the wine, on the finished wine. So it's, and how you can go back to this tasting of the base wines and have an idea of how all these different components of wines are going to fit together into a kind of a whole, and then undergo a second fermentation process, and then undergo an extended maturation process on the lees in the bottle is dauntingly complex. And how could you, and I think at the end of the day too, a lot of it is just instinct. It's not mathematical. It's and for the people that really do it, they really pay a lot of attention to this process, it's not set in stone either. So it has to change every year based on what the base wines is, and then which reserve wines you want to use and how many and what proportion. So it's very creative, and I think the people that many of the people who are working with this assemblage, it's referred to as assembly of all these different components. A lot of it is instinct. It's not just by rote.
So I have a couple of questions for you about all of it. So first of all, what I find funny is, in my experience, all the producers in Barolo or in Brunello, in Montalcino, love Champagne. Was that your experience too, that all the Italian producers love Champagne? So they must have been excited about the book that you were writing.
Certainly in Barolo. I would imagine in Brunello too, but and Chianti. But I know that the Piemontese are very very appreciative of Champagne, and they enjoy it a lot. And I know that for the Champenoise, Piemonte is an important market for them. It's also, right across the border. So
right. So you were close. So that was my other question, kind of logistically speaking. So did you move to Champagne? Did you go how long did it take you to write this book? Was it a process of some months? Was it some years? Did you go back into it? How did you kind of figure out how to create this opus?
Well, yeah, let me back up just a bit. One of the big, and I'll say who the producer was, if I may.
Please.
It's Krug, the House of Krug. And when you're thinking about this process of creating a classic cuvee, a blend of all of these different things, as opposed to a vintage wine from one particular site, Krug is really the place to go, because this is what they are all about. primarily. Now they also they also do single parcel and single vintage bottlings of champagne, like the Clos de Menil, the Clos d'Ambonnet. And they do vintage. So in the vintage, all of the grapes come from one particular harvest. With the two clos that they do, they come not just from the same vintage, but from a specific spot in a very small specific vineyard parcels. So this was really the house that I wanted to use as sort of the case in point. And it's not, so the book Krug is the house that I followed very closely. I spent a lot of time with them, and it's not really a book about Krug. It's a book about champagne. So one of the big issues right from the get-go was getting Krug to sign in on it, because champagne producers, especially the maison, tend to be a little bit closed door, a little bit secretive about their processes and how they do things and why they do them, and it maybe especially Krug. They had a reputation up until not too long ago to be a little bit reserved and not want to. In fact, they made for most of the time that the house has been active. They made a Grand Cuvée, or it was called Special Cuvée before that. It was a non-vintage wine, and they really only started making vintage wines and the Clos much later. So they would not really reveal what the recipe was, what the proportions of different grapes in a Grand Cuvée, and how much reserve wines were used in them. So they were kind of considered to be a little bit secretive about that, and they just didn't want people to worry about the details. Just enjoy the wine, But it also created a little bit of difficulty for people who love champagne and who collect it and who have a cellar, because they could never distinguish one Grand Cuvée from another. So it really is helpful to know what the base year is. If you know how much reserve wine is in it, it can help you understand the wine better. But so that was a big, I don't want to say a hurdle. It was a process to kind of propose this idea to them. And we talked about it for quite a while. And, I think that they were curious, but a little bit hesitant. And finally they said, okay. And that took a couple of years right there, just to sort of be going back and forth about this. So that was one of the big challenges right off the bat. And I have to say that once we were in agreement, then the doors were open. The doors were thrown open, and I spent a lot of time with the chef de cave and pretty much everyone else. And I did a lot of visits with, his name is Eric Lebel, although now he's not really acting as a chef de cave anymore. Now he's overseeing the entire operation, but he wanted to sort of maybe step back a little bit and take some of the pressure off. And now the person who was now the chef de cave is named Julie Caville, who I also spend a lot of time with. She was really focusing on the Clos de Menil at that time, and really kind of designated to kind of carry on the baton forwards. But so once they agreed to do it, I had pretty much full access to everything, and I was, I tried to be very careful and discreet, and but so that was a big part of it. And then I had to go through the entire process of following this wine, and that, as I said, that really begins with the development of the growing season. And I spent a lot of time in the spring and summer with Eric, driving around Champagne, looking at the vineyards, talking to the growers. And Krug is a very classic Champagne maison, also in the sense that they didn't really own very much vineyard. And right now they have a very small holding of their own vineyards, like the Clos de Menil, Clos d'Ambonnet, some of these really key sites. They purchased a little bit of vineyard, but that was fairly recently, like in the 60s or 70s. So what they rely on are sourcing grapes from throughout the Champagne growing area, and they have their suppliers, their vignerons, who they have to, and each year they have to make a contract for a specific plot of their vineyard. How much are they going to supply them with, and from where? So it's very complicated in that way too. And Eric has to go around and decide, where they're going to. Well, it was Eric. Now it's probably more Julie, but where they're going to get their grapes from who, and make a contract specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So we spent a lot of time doing that, and that was where I could really see this interaction between the chef de cave and the people who grow the grapes. So that, and then from there it went into the harvest period. And during all this time, I was living in Italy, so it was very easy to get on a plane and be there in an hour. And I would go whenever there was something happening that I needed and wanted to experience. So I did that. I didn't really. I would just stay for 3 or 4 days, but it depended on what was going on. So it was easy to get back and forth. And then after I was there for the harvest. Luckily, I was there for the beginning of the harvest with the Chardonnay. I was there at the Clos de Menil. And then I was also there at the end of harvest with Pinot Noir in the Clos d'Ambonnet. So I kind of really got to see and oftentimes in between, it went on for about 2 or 3 weeks. So I would go whenever I needed to go. And then, of course, there was the vinification process, and we tasted a little bit of wines from cask. Now, Krug also does something a little bit unique in that they ferment all of their wine in barrel, and it's not these are old barrels. When I was there in 2013, the oldest barrel that they were using was 1964. So they take care of them, they maintain them and use them for as long as they can, because they don't want the wood impact. It's just for the oxidative properties of fermentation in barrel.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even use any new barrels at all. They season them for 3 or 4 years until the impact of the wood itself, like a flavor or any sense of the woodiness of it is gone. So we tasted some of the wines out of cask in the wintertime. And then there's a break for the holidays, and then I went back in the winter to start this long process of tasting the base wines. And then after that, they had a taste through the reserve wines. And Krug has a very extensive collection of reserve wines because it's so important for them. And while they make these other wines now, the two Clos and the vintage, the Grand Cuvée is their standard bearer. That's their most important wine for them. And as Eric says, and Julie, I'm sure agrees, it's the most difficult wine to make, even though it's considerably less expensive than either one of the two Clos or a vintage. So it's much more complex because in the Clos, all the grapes come from the same small parcel. So it's a little bit easier to produce. It takes 10 years of aging, maturation, mostly on the lees before being released, compared to Grand Cuvée, which is about 7. But there, the higher price has to do with the rarity of it. It comes from one particular parcel. It's a very small parcel and unique in that sense. And they don't necessarily make them every year. So there's a lot of, this activity went right into the springtime, and then after that, it kind of culminated in the assemblage, and what the actual recipe, if you will, for the Grand Cuvée based on 2013 would be, and so that was really the whole process of creating the wine. And then it had to go through the tirage, the second fermentation, and
right.
Surly.
So this is your second book, I believe. Your first book was about Piedmont, correct?
Yes, I moved there full time in the spring of 2003, and this book happened kind of spontaneously because with the Champagne book, Champagne Uncorked, and it's called Champagne Uncorked, the House of Krug and the Timeless Allure of the world's most celebrated drink. Long title, but and that one was very much like a kind of, I wanted to really delve into this particular process that I found very fascinating and different from what I had been closely experiencing in the Barolo area. Now with the first book, that one happened kind of spontaneously. I mean, here I was, and this is post 9/11 in New York. Things were kind of at a standstill in many other places of the United States as well. But New York certainly took a hard hit with that event. So I ended up moving to Piedmont, to this little village of Castiglione Folletto, which is kind of the sleeper in a way of the Barolo villages, but it's right smack in the center of the area. And while I was there, as I mentioned, I was working a lot in the vineyards, and I had been involved with wine for a long time as well as food, but this was really my first experience face to face with grapevines. And I met a young man, who had just decided to take back his family's vineyard that had been leased out for 20 years, which is quite typical, when he was about 8 years old. And their father passed away when he was rather young, and the mother, was taking care of her two children. She could not really was not really able to work the vineyard, so they leased it out for 20 years. And when I was there, this person had just decided to not to lease out the family vineyard anymore, but to actually start to work it himself. And he needed help. So, and there I was ready, willing, and willing to help. I don't know how able I was, but because he taught me how to prune. And I was like, whoa, I have the opportunity to prune.
That's great. Yeah.
Nebbiolo vines in one of the prestigious vineyards of the Barolo area. And this is a vineyard called Mugne, which is just inside the boundary of Monforte in the Busia area. So it's like he needed the help. And so he taught me how to prune, and I had an opportunity to prune these vines, which was an amazing opportunity and a great experience. So
yeah, it sounds like it. I mean, that sounds amazing. And what I like also about your first book is you put in all these recipes, which kind of plays on your experience as a chef.
Well, for me, what this book was about was this sort of combination of things. It was very much, in a certain way, it's a wine manual, and in the sense that I was learning all these things firsthand. I knew about pruning theoretically. I knew about terroir and growing season, development of a grapevine and maturity of grapes. I knew it, but kind of in an intellectual, theoretical way. And here I was learning these things firsthand, literally. I mean, I was working with a pruning shears, and I was learning the Piemontese terminology for a lot of these processes. So and I wanted to I was making notes myself, so I didn't to kind of charting what I was doing, and didn't want to forget some of the terminology. Being a New Yorker, I was born in Chicago. I lived most of my adult life in New York City, so I'm kind of an urban metropolitan person. And here in Piemonte, when I moved there to this little village of Castiglione Folletto, population 701 with me, and that is including
You were the one? Seriously? You were
yes.
701?
Yeah, there were 700 people, and then it got bumped up to, once I became a resident, which took a little bit of time, but to go from a visitor to an actual, where I got my residenza, that's a whole other story, which is kind of narrated in this book. But So I was, I found myself in, forget about Italy, United States, France. I mean, what the really big difference here for me was the fact that I was in a very small community in a rural kind of agricultural area, and the chief agricultural product here happened to be wine. So it's right in the middle. Castellanifoletto is right in the middle of what we now know of as the Barolo wine zone. And so a big change for me was not even so much being in Italy. I felt comfortable traveling and speaking Italian, and but being in a very small community of people was a big change for me. And of course I was the outsider. I mean, I was the only American in the vicinity, not just the town, but at that point, 2003, there were really no, there was, I knew, I got to know a couple of Americans in Alba, but Alba, is the big metropolis of 34,000 people. And, that's like cut down in a flat area, right? So up in the Langhe, in the hills of the Langhe, you have these little kind of communities, the little villages, and I was really experiencing that. And when I first got there, I was like, who was this person? I was a non-entity because the Piemontese are a little bit reserved. They're great,
Right.
but it's not. They're not even like Southern Italians who they're much more informal and they're much more embracing, especially to outsiders, perhaps. But so at first, these people were, they're a little distant. And even if you pass by somebody in the town, this is like a tiny little village, right? And you don't say ciao because they don't recognize that. Ciao is informal, and they would never respond to that. Even if you said buongiorno, and at first, if they don't know you, they don't hear it. They just don't even recognize it. And
They
then
don't respond to you. That's so interesting.
and I at first I said, what's going on? I mean, but then I learned it's not that they were being impolite. It's just if there's someone who is an outsider who they don't know, they they just don't really see them. But then after a while it changed.
Did you ever consider naming your book 700, like 701?
No, I didn't. That probably would have been a good angle,
It's
Uh,
just so funny to be the 701st person in a town. It's such a small group of people.
yeah, it is. It is. And once again, this is the entire municipality in the village itself. With they call it the paese, and it's a
Mhm.
funny term
Mhm.
because in Italian paese means country, but
Mhm.
when you talk about like a municipality, you say I'm going to go in paese. It's like in the little village where the castle is and
Mhm.
where the town hall is. And in
Mhm.
Castellanifoletto, it's very small. So the town hall is just adjacent to the castle of the big castle of the Folletti. Uh, so it was it's a very small, tightly knit community. They all knew each other. I got to know them. They got to know me, and then of course people would say "Buongiorno." That at least many of them were still very polite and very formal. There were some characters there. I
Mhm.
mentioned them in my book. They were
Mhm.
the people who ran the tobacco shop,
Right.
tabacaya, the
Right.
room, and a bunch of characters. But
Who
and
you talk about in your book, I
yes,
know.
yeah,
Did
and this woman, she got to know me very well. If you need to buy an envelope or a stamp, that's where you go. And then she has to kind of ruffle through these boxes and pull out an envelope that's probably been there for 20 years. But she always spoke to me in the formal tense.
When did you come upon the idea of writing the book? Was it sort of, did you arrive there thinking maybe I'll spend a year here and write my life in Castiglione, not Castiglione, in Castelfalletto, or was it sort of as you're living there and going through all these experiences, you came upon the desire to write this book? Like, was it a life goal to you to always write a book?
No, I never really, well, actually, I did think about it because when I had my restaurant, many people asked me. You know, we had a big clientele of people in the publishing industry who had offices near where the restaurant was, and they would always come for lunch. And people would say, well, "When are you going to write a cookbook? When are you going to write a cookbook?" And I didn't feel that at that time that I had anything special to really say about it. So it was always out there, but um, I wasn't. Nothing had really occurred to me yet. And even when I went to Italy, I did not think about that. I was, as I mentioned, this was kind of post 9/11. Things were sort of at a standstill. Some changes had happened in my life. I closed the chose to close a restaurant before this whole thing happened. So it was a kind of a transitional time to begin with. And when I went there, I certainly did not go and say, oh, I'm going to go spend a year in Italy and write a book about it. Or
Hmm.
no, not at all. And in fact, I didn't really think about it. But it happened really spontaneously in the sense that, as I mentioned, when I was starting to work in the vineyards and in very prestigious vineyards in the Barolo wine area and being able to work with the vines directly, I started kind of making notes for myself about what I was doing and what I was learning, and other things like talking with people, in the cafe in the evening. All the guys, and they were all guys pretty much, who would sit around playing cards, tarocchi, and they were all speaking Piemontese. So I started to pick up some Piemontese. So I was being exposed to all these things, and I made notes about them for myself just so I wouldn't forget them. And then there was this kind of coming together of things, which a big part of it was working in the vineyards and then in the wineries and going through the entire process of, say, working with the vines in the Piemontese fashion. So pue is the Piemontese word for potare, which is to prune. So I was learning all of these terms and actually performing some of the viticultural activities that I knew about, but I had never actually done. And then there was being part of this small, very kind of, I don't want to say closed, but sort of, kind of like a unique kind of community that I hadn't really been exposed to before. And then there were the relationships that I was making with people there, and of course the cuisine, which accompanied the wines very well. But I was, really experiencing these things: the wine, the food, the people of this particular place, and that is what really kind of created the book. And so it's kind of in a way you could say it's all over the place. I mean, it's very very much focused on working in the vineyards and the sort of seasonality of that, and the whole process of when the vine wakes up and nurturing that, and tying up the canes and picking off the shoots and all of that leading up to harvest, and then what happens from there in the winery. So that's kind of like the timeline. But then in the meantime, uh, you really learning, like, where do these dishes come from, and they're not just sort of like something you read about in a book or take out of context, but they're really kind of part and parcel of this culture of and these people's lives in this particular place. So that's why the book talks a lot about wine, but it also talks a lot about uh, the typical recipes of the area. And so these are not really my recipes. I kind of tested them and collected them, but they're really like the typical regional recipes of this area that are such a big part of it.
That's so fun. And of course, you having, been a chef and owning a restaurant, it seems like a perfect combination. So, can we talk for a minute sort of about more the process of writing? So do you have a pen? I mean, I don't know, I'm sure you wrote on a computer with a computer, but do you have a time you write, a space you used to write in for your first book, for your second book, when you're writing articles? Because I know you also write articles.
Yeah.
Um, what's your writing kind of style or way that you settle into writing a book? I mean, writing a book is a big achievement.
Yeah, and it's a big undertaking, and I think it's you're not gonna. For me, it was not never like really a conscious effort. Like, well, what should I write about next? Let me see. And come up with an idea. To me, the ideas came kind of presented themselves first, and then it was a question if it and you know how it is as a writer, and even as an educator, when you decide, oh, I want to do a presentation or a class on this, something kind of appeals to you and you want to explore it, and that could be a good article. A book is it's just a different level of commitment, is a bigger undertaking. So, and it has to be something that has that kind of depth and breadth that you really want to kind of dive into. With with the first book, Romancing the Vine, it just kind of happened. And once, like I said, I mean, I was sort of recording some of the stuff that I was learning and seeing these common threads that were sort of weaving this fabric together, which was like the area, the wine, the food, the culture, the interrelationships that were taking place. And so this one, it really kind of took shape pretty quickly. And this one followed the natural timeline of the vine, of the vineyards, of the grapes growing and maturing and being harvested, and then being transformed into wine. So that's really kind of the whole overlapping timeline of it. And I don't want to say that this book wrote itself, but in a way it kind of did, because I moved to Piedmont in 2003 full time, and the Romancing the Vine was published in 2006. So it happened, and by the time I had this idea, I had all these notes and I was having these experiences, and I didn't really know where it was going to go, but I mentioned it to someone in New York who's in the publishing industry, and he said, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. And so he pitched it, and we got a publishing house and a contract and all that. And then it was just a question of of putting it to paper and finding the right structure and weaving all the material in together. So, I mean, that's a pretty quick turnaround, at least for me.
Yeah, very quick. That's a very quick turnaround. And then your second book, less quick.
The Champagne book was very different, because here, like with the first one, Romancing the Vine, I was there. I was living it. I had experienced it. I was kind of just doing these things without intentionally doing them for a book. But then it kind of started to all come together, and took that. And I don't want to say, oh, it was easy. Here's my like stack of notes. Just turn it into a book. It was hard to really formulate all that, and create a structure that worked, and a narrative, and also eliminate things that didn't quite fit for whatever reason. So it took a lot of work to do it, but it basically had all the pieces were all there. With the Champagne book, so and once again, I didn't set out to write, and I didn't say, oh, my next one is going to be about champagne. Let me go and figure out what to do, or make a champagne guide. And there are many of those. In this case, as I mentioned kind of at the outset, I became fascinated with this idea of a classic cuvee, of a blend of all these different components, and then the process of making a classic méthode champenoise wine, where you create all this base wine, which is a sum of all these like different ingredients, and then they undergo a secondary fermentation process, which is wild, and then they spend extended period of time on the lees. So I really wanted to delve into that, and I didn't want to do it, and I didn't want it to be too technical. I wanted it to be something that would be accessible to anybody that's interested in wine, but also maybe of interest to people who were pros, who knew a lot about champagne and about wine, that they would still find something worthwhile in it. And so I really wanted to just focus on that aspect of it and follow one producer through the entire process, step by step, and experience it myself. And as I mentioned, Krug was really the ideal candidate for that, and miraculously they agreed to it. And that took a long time right there, just trying to get that access to make it happen. I could have just sat down and written a book about the process of making champagne, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to experience it firsthand, and they were the very best possible people to do it with. So,
and how fun to do a book on Krug. I mean,
it was
what a great year.
it was great.
It must have been an incredible experience to have access to those wines.
And I spent a lot of time with there at the Maison. I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, with the chef de cave, Eric Libel, who was really the first. He worked with the previous generation of the Krugs as their chef de cave, and they were still very much involved in the winemaking process at that time. And then once things changed with the house, and it was acquired by Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, LVMH. So then Eric really became the chef de cave. No, I was just going to say, and with him too, we, as I mentioned, we traveled a lot to visit their suppliers, the vignerons, and I saw all of these different personalities, the wine growers that they work with, in some cases for generations.
Right.
And I realized that actually, aside from just getting grape juice and fermenting it and then making a kind of a blend of them, I realized that these suppliers, their personalities are really in there too. So that brings something else to the table, that you meet the producer, the grower. They're not really the producer. In some cases, they will they'll sell wine to other people. Krug ferments all of their juice, but these growers, their personality somehow comes across in the wines that their grapes ultimately make.
Did you use the same agent for your second book, or
No.
did you find another one, or how did that process go for you?
The process was, this was 10 years later than the first one. So things had changed a bit. And it was kind of a difficult process in that it was first taken up by a very large publishing house, very prestigious publishing house, and then it just kept the editors that I was going to be working with kept changing. They changed like 3 or 4 times, and then after that, the person that I was working with to try to place it, we said, look, this is just it's not going to happen. It's a musical chairs of editors here, and so we found another publishing house. It was pretty small and independent at that point, but then it got acquired by Hachette. So and then that was a fine process, but that's always very tricky to find, to get a publishing house, and even once you do that, get an editor that you can really we really work with. I mean, I can work with just about anyone, but someone who can really see the value and the idea, and then help bring that alive. And for me, I'm very collaborative. I love feedback and input from editors, and the editor that I wound up with was very nice. She was not like a seasoned wine person, which was great, because I wanted someone who could who was not an expert and was not, you know, a wine book publisher per se or editor, but someone who liked wine, but more than that, wanted, you know, liked editing and helping create a product that is accessible to many different people.
That's such an interesting part, piece of writing a book. People often don't think about that relationship. I mean, people who've written books do, but if you're just kind of one of those people, it's like, oh, I want to write a book. It's a hard and a long process. And was it long from the time you kind of finished your manuscript to when it was published? Was it published last year or was it this
It was
year?
published.
It was
No,
last year, right?
it was a few years ago. It was published in 2016.
Oh, it's already been 2016. Wow, time has flown. So, do you have a next book in mind? Are you thinking about something else that's, working in with your new life post this second opus?
Well, I don't really have anything yet. It seems, and this is not conscious at all, but it seems like I kind of go in 10-year segments for a book. So there are a few ideas out there, but nothing I've really zeroed in on yet that I'm really willing to make a commitment to. But one other thing, if I could, about the Champagne book. So this
Sure.
one took kind of a whole different form and process than the first one did, because here there were two. You know, the big narrative for me was going through this process firsthand of following along and sort of exploring the process of making this classic cuvee step by step. And it's a very, very long process in Champagne. I mean, it takes years to make it and to mature it. And then you also, time goes backwards too, because you're using a lot of reserve wines. And so, you know, there's a kind of time stretch there of bringing in wines that were produced and have been stored and held for many years that are going to add a different dimension to this wine, and then carrying it forward with, I mean, a vintage Champagne requires at least 3 years on the on the lees, and even more for, I mean, you can always go beyond that. So it's a long period. But once I started really thinking about how one could kind of narrate this in a way that would be interesting and digestible, and maybe give people insights into this whole process, very early on, I realized that you can't just talk about making a classic Champagne cuvee. You have to understand how it came about and why, and how this whole kind of crazy process was developed. And so I realized that I really needed to go back in history and to see where the Champagne method, as we know it, why did it come about, and how, and by who, and what was that process like, and where has it gone from there. So I didn't really set out to write a book about history, but that is the whole other kind of narrative of this book, is the whole history of Champagne from the very earliest period all the way up to the present and beyond that. So there are these like kind of two timelines, and I struggled a little bit with how to work them, to how to structure it, because I didn't want to just, you know, typically you would say, okay, here's the history of Champagne, part one, and now here is the process of doing this, part two. I didn't want to do that, because I wanted to really keep the focus on the activity and the experiences that I was having, and this sort of firsthand narrative of this process that I was experiencing. So but how do you get the history in there so that it makes sense to people when they're hearing about all of this crazy stuff, like accumulating parcels of grapes from 300 different suppliers or parcels? It's nuts. Or the process of sitting down and tasting all of these base wines, 15 a day for months. So I had to find a way of intertwining these two narratives. And at a certain point, I just sat down, and this was kind of, I mean, it would only make sense for this book, but I got like long pieces of paper, and I made a timeline of the process of making the wine as I was experiencing it, and when it happened and how long it took and all that kind of what the procedure was. I made a whole timeline from very beginning to to end and beyond, because the actual narrative of my being there was when it went into the bottle and for the secondary fermentation and the time sur lie, which is still going on. So that was one, and then the other was the whole history of Champagne from the very earliest period to the present and beyond. And so that then I overlapped them, and I had to of course stretch out the history of Champagne, which is hundreds of years, over the kind of shorter window of the period of actually making of producing this wine based on the 2013 vintage, with the time frame going back to the reserve wines. And Krug is famous for keeping a very big collection of reserve wines that go back way back. I think the oldest one that was used in that wine was 1995, and then they go way forward in terms of the maturation period. So, I found a way to kind of overlap these two timelines, and then it sort of clicked in a very, very logical kind of way.
That makes a lot of sense. For this particular project that you were working on, and you're really just making me want to have a glass of champagne in front of me right now to toast you and all of that work on both of these books. So my last question for you is: are there regions or particular producers that you're really excited about now, wines or spirits or something that really excites you in the wine industry today?
Oh my God, I don't even know. I wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, there's so many. I really have a close affinity with French and Italian wine, but I'm not limited to that, and other things kind of pop up here and there. But even within those realms, there's so much that kind of grabs my attention. I mean, this is nothing new for me, but when I was actually in Champagne, I became aware of the still wine of Champagne, Coteau Champenois, and I was fascinated by this idea, and it was very hard to actually find any of them, even in Reims when I was staying there. So I became very interested in that, and I still am. And I think that's kind of a repeating theme of because I've done a lot of research and work as far as kind of comparing these two versions of Champagne, and it's fascinating to see a wine that everybody just assumes is sparkling wine. And it, of course, like any sparkling wine, historically, like sparkling wine in general, was an accident. And the same thing, I was also very involved with Prosecco. The same thing happened there. There is a still version of Prosecco in the historic area of that. So I'm very fascinated.
Yeah. I was going to say, that was exactly my question. I was going to ask if you were fascinated by still wine in Prosecco. And I guess the answer is yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And now in Champagne, it's really becoming more popular. And I remember when in 2003 and 4, when I was spending a lot of time there, whenever I went out to dinner, I would ask, people, do you have any Coteau Champenois on your list? And they said, oh, no, monsieur. I would say, why? We're in one of the capitals of Champagne. Oh, but we get much better wines that are less expensive from Burgundy. Well, yes, but they're not the same. They're not the same. And now there are many people in Champagne that are really giving a lot of attention to their Coteau Champenois, and there are many people that are starting to produce them, like Drapier and the Aube, and I think there's also I believe that Roederer just came out recently with some new Coteau Champenois, because it gives you a whole different vision onto the sparkling wine. I love sparkling wine, but to taste some of these still wines from that area, I love the bubbles, but this is it allows you to get to know where that wonderful sparkling wine comes from. And it makes you realize, and the Champenois have realized this, that Champagne is not just about the bubbles; it's a wine. So that is very key. And
Do any of the still wines from Champagne make it to the United States? Do you know? Are any of them sold here?
absolutely, absolutely, they are. They tend to be well, kind of like the restaurateurs and Ross said, they tend to be very expensive. But there's nothing quite like them. For example, there's Bollinger
Hmm.
makes an exceptional Coteau Champenois. It's called l'enfant, something like the hill of the enfant. I have it right here in my wine cup. I got this one. I got from visiting Bollinger, but les coins des enfants, something like that.
I like that sound of wines tinkling in the background. You're just making me want to have a drink. I guess it's only 11 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not at a class or doing a tasting, so I would
It's
be
fun.
remiss if I open a bottle. Not that I have a Coteau Champenoise here, but you're making me want to go out and buy one. So
But
you think,
their wine is called La Côte aux Enfants, and it's an amazing vineyard, very steep. And this is the wine that Bollinger, if they're going to make a Grand Année rosé
Mhm,
wine, they
mhm,
use the Pinot Noir from this Les Côtes des Enfants to make the rosé. But on
right,
its own, they produce it. Lily Bollinger wanted to make a still wine from this parcel, and they make it in very small quantities, and it's an exceptional wine. And now, okay, it's a little pricey because it's so rare. And could you compare it to like uh, a great Burgundy from a Grand Cru?
mhm,
Yes, but you can't. But they're not the same. They're both made from Pinot
right.
Noir, but they're very, very different terroirs, and they express their different terroirs. So
Well, thank you for bringing that up because that is a big topic that I actually almost never talk about and I find super interesting. So, I want to thank you so much for dedicating all of this time to speaking with me and my listeners. And I want to just repeat the names of your books for a moment. And do you have a website? Is it alantardi.com or is
it is.
there a
Yes, it is.
website? Is it? Yes, it is. So what are the names of your books and are they available, let's say, on Amazon or in a store near you?
Yes. So the first one is called Romancing the Vine: Life, Love, and Transformation in the Vineyards of Barolo. And that was published by St. Martin's Press. And the Champagne book is, it has a very long name: Champagne Uncorked, the House of Krug, and the Timeless Allure of the World's Most Celebrated Drink, which is published by Public Affairs, which is part of Hachette.
Well, that was fantastic. So thank you so much for speaking with me, Alan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Susanna. It was a pleasure. Anytime.
So I was just speaking with Alan Tardi about two of his books, one about his experiences living in a small town in Piedmont, and the other about the famed Champagne House Krug. My next guest next week will be Steve Ray, who has written a book called How to Get U.S. Market Ready. It's for wine and spirits brands that want to find out how to get into the United States market. I look forward to speaking with him and learning about his tips on writing his opus. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
This is Vigneto, a podcast.
From the sun and soil they grow, from the land and sea they roam.